Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the small island of Corsica, is one of the most famous men to have ever lived, hailed as the man of the 19th century. Even his very name is used as a word to describe something momentous, colossal, Napoleonic. A rags to riches story, Napoleon was only 24 years old when he became a general, and 35 when he crowned himself Emperor of the French. Charismatic leader of men, shrewd politician, and a military genius, Napoleon fought 60 battles in his career and only lost 7 of them, making him the most victorious general in history. Not since the days of ancient Rome and the Caesars had one man conquered so much of Europe, or held so much power. To some he was a god, to others the Antichrist. And his meteoric rise and then crushing downfall has been compared to a Greek tragedy. After less than 15 years in power, in the last of 7 wars formed against him by coalitions of European monarchs, Napoleon was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled to the remote rocky island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. At the end of his life, reflecting on his misfortunes, Napoleon's analysis was, "I have too much ambition and a spirit of fire." This is the story of Napoleon and the dawn of a new age. Napoleon's Italian campaign was his debut on the world stage, taking command of a ragged army devoid of hope and transforming it into a victorious fighting force, which in less than 1 year would defeat no less than 6 successive enemy armies, despite the French being constantly outnumbered. Many years later, during his exile, one of Napoleon's friends would remark, "Such a rapid succession of brilliant victories, filling the world with your fame, must have been a source of great delight to you." By no means. Those who think so know nothing of the peril of our situation. The victory of today was instantly forgotten in the necessity of winning a new one the next day. Danger was continually before me. I did not enjoy a moment of repose. In January 1797, it was a new year, but familiar problems for 27-year-old General Bonaparte, who was, in a sense, back to square one. Napoleon has the great fortress city of Mantua under siege, and after a narrow victory at Arcole, he had once again driven back the Austrian armies trying to march to its aid. Inside Mantua, in 4 months of siege, 9,000 Austrians have died of wounds, disease, or malnutrition. Now, there are less than 10,000 men fit for service. Survivors live off horse meat, civilians off rats and dogs. Even these miserable rations will run out by the 27th of January, just a few weeks away. The clock was ticking. The Austrians must relieve the trapped General Wurmser and his men by that date, or lose the city, and with it, the war in Italy. As December brings bitter cold and heavy snow to northern Italy, for now, both the French and Austrians settle into their winter quarters. The Tyrol was in French hands, and Napoleon, to try to prevent the peasants from rising up in guerrilla bands, issued a warning that every Tyrolese found with weapons in hand would be shot as a brigand. Alvinczi retaliated that for every peasant shot, he would hang a French prisoner of war. Napoleon retorted that for every French prisoner slain in this way, he would hang an Austrian officer, beginning with Alvinci's own nephew, who was in his hands. On reflection, both generals decided to disengage from this tit-for-tat. One of Napoleon's major concerns was the wretched state of medical care for his men. The hospitals lack everything. Our wounded are lying on the floors, and in the most horrible state of destitution. Troops have not been paid for weeks. Their uniforms are disintegrating, their shoes are worn out, and above all, they are hungry. In December, Napoleon wrote to the Directory, "The enemy is withdrawing his troops from the Rhine to send them to Italy. Do the same. Help us. We are only asking for more men." Meanwhile, once again, the the Pope had been amassing forces to attack the French from behind. For this act of treachery, Napoleon summoned Cardinal Martel from his fasting and prayers in the convent and asked him to send a message to the Pope. "Rome desires war. It shall have war. But first, I owe it to humanity to make a final effort to recall the Pope to reason. My army is strong. I have only to will it, and the temporal power of the Pope is destroyed. Still, France allows me to listen to words of peace. War, so cruel for all, has terrible results for the vanquished. I am anxious to close this struggle by peace. War has for me now neither danger nor glory." However, the Pope believed that the Austrians would soon crush Napoleon, and he remained defiant. Meanwhile, Barras and his fellow directors had their eyes riveted on Napoleon. They were pleased with the arrival of 40 million francs, but also worried by Napoleon's tendency to take an independent line. First had been the treaty with Piedmont, judged too lenient. Then Napoleon's high-handed attitude and refusal to share the command jointly with General Kellerman. And now there were reports that he was snubbing Salicetti and Garreau, the director's own representatives. Napoleon had always denied being ambitious, as he had put it to Carnot, the Minister of War. "If there is in France a single man, honest and true, who can suspect my political intentions, I at once resign the pleasure of serving my country. 3 or 4 months of retirement will silence envy, restore my health, and allow me to fill to better advantage whatever position the government may entrust to me. When the time shall have come, it will only be by leaving the army of Italy in season that I shall be able to devote the rest of my life to the defence of the Republic. Not to let men grow old is the whole art of government. When I entered a public career, I took for my principle everything for my country. The esteem of a few such men as you, that of my comrades and the soldiers, sometimes too the opinion of posterity, and above all, the state of my own conscience and the prosperity of my country, alone interest me." But the Directory were wary and wanted to find out how sincere he was. It might be necessary to arrest him for political ambition, just as they had the 2 previous commanders of this army. They decided to send General Clark, a man of proven loyalty, to find out. Officially, his job would be to arrange an armistice with the Austrians. In fact, he had orders to spy on Napoleon. With his shrewd eyes, he began taking notes. Berthier, he observed, had high moral standards and no interest in politics. Massena was brave, but slack about discipline, and very fond of money. As for Napoleon, Clark gave a vivid description of him: thin, the skin clinging to his bones, eyes bright with fever. For 9 days, Clark secretly observed Napoleon and sent back the following report. "He is feared, loved, and respected in Italy. I believe he is attached to the Republic, and without any ambition, save to retain the reputation he has won. It is a mistake to think he is a party man. He belongs neither to the royalists, who slander him, nor to the extremists, whom he dislikes. He has only one guide, the Constitution. But General Bonaparte is not without defects. Sometimes he is hard, impatient, abrupt, or imperious. Often he demands difficult things in too hasty a manner. He has not been respectful enough towards the government commissioners. When I reproved him for this, he replied that he could not possibly treat otherwise men who were universally scorned for their immorality and incapacity." What Napoleon had in mind was that Salicetti ruthlessly pillaged churches and enriched himself by selling chalices containing consecrated hosts on the streets. This set a bad example at a time when Napoleon was doing everything in his power to curb even minor looting. Clark recognized that Napoleon's attitude to them was justified. Salicetti has a reputation for being the most shameless rogue in the army, and Garreau is inefficient. Neither is suitable for the army in Italy. Overall, Clark was extremely impressed by Napoleon, heralding him as the new Alexander, and added, "It is indispensable that the General-in-Chief should conduct all the diplomatic operations in Italy." When they read his report, the directors decided that their suspicions about Napoleon were unfounded. They promised him their full support, and in their letters and orders showed a renewed confidence in whatever decisions he might make. This came just in time, for Napoleon was now facing his gravest threat. In Mantua, the Austrian garrison is near its limit. Starvation is imminent, though Wurmser is determined to hold out to the last, and is awaiting yet another, the 5th Austrian army, sent to try to save the city. A final offensive that would decide the fate of the war in Italy. Napoleon, having received just 7,000 reinforcements, prepares to meet Alvinci's advance. But he will not only be outnumbered, he doesn't know where his enemy of 47,000 men will strike. Plus, Napoleon must hold one division back to cover Wurmser's garrison, commanded once more by General Serrurier. Augereau's division watches the Adige, while Massena guards Verona. The northern division has a new commander. Napoleon has sacked Vaubois for his poor performance, and put in his place General Joubert, a hard-working, brave, and exceptionally modest commander, who, like Napoleon, is just 27. The Austrian General Alvinczi has received 14,000 reinforcements and orders to relieve Mantua as soon as possible. He is eager to march, but heavy snow and the late arrival of equipment and supplies delays his advance until the 7th of January. The first columns move off, but their offensive is only a diversion intended to draw Napoleon's attention away from the main threat, which will be coming down the Adige Valley. Alvinczi has divided this force into 6 columns. Their mission is to envelop and destroy Joubert's division at Rivoli and clear the path to Mantua. But Rivoli is a strong defensive position. They must hit it hard and fast before the French can respond. But serious planning failures quickly emerge. Lusignan's first column, on the right flank of the advance, has orders to cross the slopes of Monte Baldo and attack Joubert from the rear. But it's soon clear that these orders are wildly optimistic, dreamt up by staff officers who'd not seen the terrain, with slopes covered in deep snow and ice. The paths are treacherous, and there was no firewood for making camp. Only by taking a wide detour could Lusignan make any progress at all, whilst losing 200 men to exhaustion and exposure. A British officer, Colonel Graham, who was in Austrian service, remarked, "I cannot think it was prudent to adopt a plan which, at this season, a fall of snow might render totally impractical." Meanwhile, the 2nd and 3rd Austrian columns reach the French outpost at Ferrara. An initial attack is repulsed. They wait for Lusignan's column to appear before launching a second attack. However, Lusignan's column is not yet in sight. Alvinci's plan relied on swift, bold action, but just 48 hours in, it's falling apart. Napoleon pondered the incoming reports, uncertain of their line of march, or on what points they would fall. He knew that Joubert's forward outpost is under attack at Ferrara, that Massena has repulsed an Austrian attack on Verona, and Augereau faces a sizable Austrian force near Legnano, poised to cross the Adige River. At first, he wonders if Alvinczi is using the same tactics as before, making his attack from the east. In the night, a courier galloped into Napoleon's camp, with the news that the Austrians had made their appearance. Joubert's scouts had detected an enemy column moving around his flank. He has no doubt that he faces a major Austrian attack and has begun withdrawing his forces down to Rivoli. The report I have given you is exact. Be assured the enemy will make every effort to throw me onto the blockade of Mantua. The enemy's plan has been unmasked, Napoleon announced, and issues a flurry of orders. Massena is to march immediately to reinforce Joubert. Augereau is to send him cavalry and guns, while the rest of his division keeps watch on the east. General Rey is to move up to Castelnuovo. Serrurier is to be on high alert for an attempted breakout by the Mantua garrison, while Joubert, the youngest and least experienced of Napoleon's divisional commanders, is instructed to hold Rivoli at any cost and is assured that help is on the way. General Massena declared to his division, "Bonaparte demands a last effort from you to annihilate the remains of the Austrian army, who have dared to come again and measure themselves against the Republicans." After trouncing the Austrians at Ferrara, Joubert has extricated himself overnight and taken up a defensive position around Rivoli. Napoleon arrives around midnight and immediately sets out with Joubert to inspect the enemy's positions. Napoleon observed, that the lines of enemy fires filled the country between the Adige and Lake Garda, and the atmosphere was ablaze with them. One could easily distinguish 5 camps, each composed of a column. Until reinforcements arrive, Napoleon has just Joubert's division, 10,000 men, to hold off 24,000 Austrians. Napoleon was outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. The news of their commanders-in-chief's arrival spread through the ranks like wildfire. Joubert had already earned a good reputation, and his men were proud of belonging to his division, but even they were worried, until the arrival of their little corporal on the battlefield. "The general is here with us. We're going to win." But Alvinczi was to help even the odds, by ordering Lusignan's first column to attempt a wide outflanking march to cut off the French line of retreat. Napoleon decides that the main road to Rivoli, which passes through a deep defile known as the Pontare, can be held by a single regiment supported by entrenched cannon. This leaves more manageable odds of 9,000 French against 12,000 Austrians in the centre. But Napoleon wanted to push out his defensive line to hold the slopes that mark the edge of the Rivoli plateau. He also correctly judged that the artillery had not arrived, and so decided on an immediate attack. At 4 a.m, General Vial's light infantry brigade advances through the darkness. Napoleon targeted the strongest corps, made up of all the guns and cavalry. They drive back the Austrian outposts and take the San Marco chapel. They are followed on their left by the rest of Joubert's division. But the French push too far. Skirmishes break out along the line, with heavy fighting at the heights of San Marco. Napoleon had not wanted to start the battle so early, but the fight escalates. At dawn, the Austrians attack the plateau in force. The French 85th Demi-Brigade is outflanked and routed. The 29th Light on its right is forced to retreat, and it looks like the French line is crumbling. But the 14th, on their right, fights tenaciously. In an intense infantry battle across broken ground, vineyards and walled gardens, with sudden charges, hurried withdrawals and countercharges. When the Austrians overrun a French battery, an officer demands, "14th, will you let them take your guns?" His troops launch a ferocious charge that routs the Austrians and reclaims the battery. By 9 a.m, Massena's troops have begun to arrive, just in the nick of time. With his cool head, Massena proved completely reliable, having completed his 20-mile all-night march. Napoleon rode to meet Massena and exclaimed to him, "You are truly the spoiled child of victory." And together at the head of the division, to the sound of the chant de départ, they charged, sabres drawn, and managed to stubbornly re-establish their shattered left wing. The buckled French line is stabilized. But so far, the French have only faced half of Alvinci's 6 columns. One by one, the others now join the action. Vukasovich's 6th column is on the far side of the Adige River, but its guns cause havoc among French troops holding the Pontare. Under this covering fire, Rousse's 5th column charges up the narrow road, and in fierce fighting storms the French entrenchments. This advance threatens the entire French right wing with encirclement, and a retreat begins. Moments later, gunfire to the southwest reveals Lusignan's 1st column has reached Affy, poised to cut off any chance of the French escaping. When the Austrians had seemingly completely enveloped him, cutting off his retreat and attacking him in the front, flanks and rear, Napoleon, to gain time, sent a flag of truce to Alvinczi, proposing a suspension of arms for half an hour. The Austrian general fell into the snare. The roar of battle stopped, and the combatants rested on their guns. Junot was sent to the Austrian headquarters, where he kept Alvinczi busy for half an hour, discussing terms. As expected, no terms could be agreed upon, while in the meantime, Napoleon rearranged his army to repel the Austrians. The French situation is desperate. They are outnumbered, surrounded, and under heavy attack. Napoleon's staff look anxiously to their commander, wondering what miracle can save the army now. Captain Thibault remembered. All looks turned towards General Bonaparte, but after a short inspection, he limited himself to saying calmly, "They are ours." Sensing victory, General Alvinczi and his staff ride forward to urge his infantry on. Napoleon remains calm. He knows Alvinci's centre columns are near exhaustion, and that they have no cavalry and little artillery support. He identifies Rousse's column as the most immediate threat, and orders Joubert to send every man and gun he can spare for a counter-attack. General Leclerc and a 21-year-old Captain Lassalle then charge with the entire French cavalry, just a few hundred horsemen. Under this onslaught, the lead Austrian troops are driven back into the gorge. Here they collide with the rest of the column coming up, cavalry and infantry jammed together. Some pushing forward, others trying to escape back. Joubert's men pour fire down on them from the overlooking ridge. The final straw is the devastating explosion of an ammunition wagon. Austrian morale breaks. The Austrian survivors flood back down the road to safety. Napoleon now turns his full attention to the centre, where the exhausted Austrian columns have become spread out and disordered. The sudden appearance of French cavalry, supported by infantry and guns, sparks panic and a mass rout. Alvinczi, who must have thought himself on the cusp of victory moments before, had to join in an undignified race to the rear, spreading further alarm among his men. By 1 p.m, the bulk of the Austrian army is in headlong flight, leaving Lusignan's first column in an awkward position. Completely isolated, he begins a fighting withdrawal. But the arrival of General Rey's brigade behind him triggers a rout. Fewer than half of his 4,000 men escape. By 5 p.m, having had 3 horses shot from under him, Napoleon was victorious. The Austrians manoeuvred admirably and failed only because they are incapable of calculating the value of minutes. The Battle of Rivoli, Napoleon always saw as one of the most dreadful battles he ever fought, and one of the most memorable. Nothing but his tactics won it, as the odds were greatly against him. Although actually surrounded on the field by speed and brilliant flanking movements, the army of Italy has turned a grim situation into an astonishing triumph. French casualties are modest, with 2,200 killed and wounded, and 1,000 taken prisoner, while Austrian losses of 4,000 killed and wounded and 8,000 prisoners are devastating. Over the next few days, 5,000 more Austrians are captured as they struggle back through the mountain passes, and dozens of flags, including, Napoleon noticed, the one embroidered by the Empress of Austria herself. Napoleon had already marched all of one night and fought all of that next day. His victory, however, was not yet complete. Before the battle smoke had died away, he's received news that Provera has crossed the Adige and is marching on Mantua. If these two forces combined, everything would be jeopardized. It's a chance for him to strike one more blow against the enemy and to seal the fate of Mantua. Napoleon, although nearly collapsing from fatigue and still miraculously holding onto his saddle, said to Lassalle in a hoarse whisper, while the enemy flags were religiously laid before him, "Sleep on them, you've earned it, but only for a quarter of an hour, because we're leaving for Mantua." Leaving Joubert in command at Rivoli, with orders to renew the attack at dawn, Napoleon races south with Massena's division. Provera has no clue of the disaster that's engulfed Alvinci's army, nor that the French are now gathering around him. The Austrian pushes on to Mantua, shadowed by Augereau, who snaps up his rear guard, taking 2,000 men prisoner. With just 7,000 men left, Provera's only hope is to break through the French siege lines. First, he tries to attack San Giorgio. Formidable French defences and a powerful cannonade stop him cold. The next day, he launches a coordinated attack with Wurmser against French forces at La Favorita. But Napoleon has now arrived with Massena's division from the north. Wurmser's weak, starving men are forced back into the citadel, while a determined charge smashes into Provera's side. With Augereau approaching from the east, Provera faces impossible odds. He surrenders his entire force of 7,000 men. Wurmser's last hope of rescue have been crushed, and the French remained undisputed masters of Italy. This campaign was ended in 3 days. So great was the terror now inspired by the name of Napoleon at this time, that another group of 6,000 Austrians surrendered to only 500 French. Austrian losses in the campaign reach a staggering 44,000 men. The French troops had travelled over 90 miles in 5 days and fought 3 massive battles. Massena's division had marched incessantly for 4 days, marching by night and fighting by day. The French do not march, they fly, the Austrians said. Napoleon could pride himself on the fact that his soldiers had surpassed the famous speed of Caesar's legions. The Roman legions used to make 24 miles a day. Our men make 30 and fight in the intervals. After his victory at Mantua, Napoleon was confined to his bed for almost 2 weeks. From sickness and exhaustion, he was practically given up for dead, to the army's despair. Wurmser's situation was now hopeless. He puts off the inevitable for 2 more agonizing weeks. Nearly 17,000 Austrians had died in Mantua over the course of the last 8 months, and half the garrison were in hospital. Famine was now staring them in the face. Wurmser sent an aide-de-camp to Serrurier's tent to propose terms of surrender. He talked at length about how Wurmser could still resist, and his many supplies. Napoleon was sitting in the corner of the tent unnoticed, wrapped in his cloak. Without making himself known, Napoleon listened. At last, he approached the table, silently picked up the paper, and to the envoy's astonishment, wrote on the margins his answers to the terms suggested. "There," Napoleon said, "are the conditions which I grant to your marshal. If he had provisions but for a fortnight, and could talk of surrender, he would not deserve an honourable capitulation. As he sends you, he must be reduced to extremity. I respect his age, his valour, his misfortunes. Carry to him the terms which I grant. Whether he leaves the place tomorrow, in a month, or in 6 months, he shall have neither better nor worse conditions. He may stay as long as his sense of honour demands." Glancing over the terms, the envoy was surprised by Napoleon's moderation, and then confessed that they only had enough provisions for 3 days. The Directory wanted Napoleon to shoot Wurmser as a traitor, a Frenchman who had taken arms against France. But Napoleon, who respected Wurmser's courage, disregarded the order, allowing him to return to Austria unharmed. To make his departure less humiliating, Napoleon allowed him to march out of the place with 500 of his staff, 200 horses, and 6 cannon. The rest of the garrison, still 20,000 strong, surrendered their weapons, were kept as prisoners of war, and were put to work in agriculture and building projects in France. Wurmser gratefully accepted this offer, and in return told Napoleon of a plot being laid in the Papal States to poison him, which perhaps saved his life. The Directory were dissatisfied with the terms, but Napoleon simply replied, "I have granted the Austrian general such terms as, in my judgment, were due to a brave and honourable enemy, and to the dignity of the French Republic." A few days later, Napoleon wrote to the Directory, "I was anxious to show French generosity to Wurmser, a general more than 70 years old, to whom fortune has been unkind, but who has never ceased to show a constancy and a courage that history will not forget." The next morning, the half-starved Austrian army marched from the gates of Mantua to throw down their weapons at the feet of the French. But rather than witnessing the satisfying spectacle of the famous General Wurmser passing vanquished before him, that morning Napoleon mounted his horse and left for the Papal States at the head of a division. Instead, Napoleon left the elderly Serrurier to accept Wurmser's sword, the age-old military custom of surrender. After 8 months, the siege of Mantua is over. For many, the sight of Wurmser and his dispirited staff, stripped of almost all their flags, guns and men, wearily setting out on the road to Vienna, was a personification of Austria's total defeat in Italy. Since the beginning of April 1796, in 10 months, Napoleon, with a force never more than 44,000 men, had conquered 5 armies under veteran generals, made up of nearly 300,000 highly disciplined Austrian troops. He had taken 100,000 prisoners and killed or wounded 35,000 men. Napoleon had soundly beaten 4 army commanders, Generals Colli and Beaulieu, and the famous marshals Wurmser and Alvinczi, but it was still not yet over. Austria would soon send him their greatest soldier, the brother of the Emperor of Austria himself, Archduke Charles. He has just received orders to crush the French army and re-establish Austria as the dominant power in Europe. But first, Napoleon had orders to march south to punish the Pope, who had once again been agitating against the French and threatening Napoleon from behind with an army of 40,000 men. Pope Pius and his cardinals detested the French Republic. The spirit of independence which the French were introducing into Italy could only weaken clerical and monarchical power. While Napoleon's back was turned, they openly sympathised with Austria and had made Rome a centre of royalist emigre activities. Therefore, the Directory ordered Napoleon to march south a second time and explain the new reality of political power in Italy. Napoleon welcomed this move, but for a different reason. It would safeguard his rear when the time came for him to march into Austria. On the 1st of February, Napoleon set out, bowling into the Papal States. Napoleon took with him just 4,500 French soldiers, helped by 4,000 Italian recruits. He proclaimed, "The French army is about to enter the Pope's territories. It will protect religion and the people. The French soldier carries in one hand the bayonet as the guarantee of victory, in the other the olive branch, a symbol of peace and a pledge of protection. Woe to those who shall provoke the vengeance of this army. To the inhabitants of every town and village, peace, protection and security are offered." Meanwhile, all the spiritual machinery of the Papal Church was put in motion. The tocsin tolled in every village, 40 hours of prayers were offered, indulgences promised, and even miracles were used. Napoleon first came across the enemy, 7,000 strong, under Cardinal Bouchcha, entrenched on the banks of the Senio River. The Cardinal sent an envoy to Napoleon, who declared, in the name of the Cardinal-in-Chief, that if the French continued to advance, he would certainly fire on them. The French officers couldn't help but laugh at this threat. Napoleon replied that he would be extremely sorry to expose himself to the Cardinal's fire, and, as the army was very tired, it would set up camp for the night. But in the middle of the night, a division of the French army was sent across the stream by a ford to cut off the retreat of the Papal troops. And in the morning, in just an hour, nearly every enemy was dead on the field or a prisoner in Napoleon's hands. Rapidly pressing on, the French arrived the same day at Faenza. The gates were shut, ramparts manned with cannons, and the crowds heckled the French. The gates were soon battered down, and the French rushed into the city, clamouring for permission to pillage it. They claimed that the case was the same as Pavia. No, at Pavia, the people, after having taken an oath of obedience, revolted and attempted to murder our soldiers, who were their guests. These people are deceived and must be subdued by kindness. All the prisoners taken here and in the previous battle were gathered in the large garden of one of the convents. The crowds were terrified, expecting they'd been gathered there to be shot. Napoleon and the French had been described to them as atheistic and cruel monsters. On Napoleon's approach, they fell to their knees with cries for mercy. Napoleon spoke to them in Italian, declaring, "I am the friend of all the people of Italy. I come among you for your good. You are all free. Return to the hearts of your families and tell them that the French are the friends of religion and of order, and of all the poor and the oppressed." Then he went into the convent's refectory, where the captured Italian officers were gathered, chatting with them for a while, explaining his motives and his wishes, speaking of the liberty of Italy, and of the abuses of the papal government, its gross violations of the spirit of the gospel, and the blood they would be spending in vain to resist his army. Napoleon gave them all permission to return to their homes, and simply asked them, as the price of his clemency, to make known to their communities his feelings. Napoleon soon met another army of the Romans at Ancona on the 9th of February. He cautiously surrounded them and took them all prisoners without injuring a man. "I have nothing against the Pope nor the Church, only against Cardinal Bouchcha and a handful of sycophants who sold out to the Austrians." The harbour of Ancona was one of the most important ports in the Adriatic, but was in such a poor state that not even a frigate could sail into it. So Napoleon decided to repair and improve the port, public works which were quickly executed. At Loreto, there was a famous image of the Virgin Mary, which the church claimed was of celestial origin and was supposedly shedding tears at the French invasion. Napoleon sent for the sacred image, examined it, and exposed the trick by which, through a string of glass beads, tears appeared to flow, and had the priests imprisoned for deluding the people with trickery. Generally, resistance was slight. One day, Lannes, commanding the advance guard, came across several hundred papal cavalry. Although Lannes only had a few staff officers with him, he galloped up to the enemy. "Halt," he ordered. They halted. "Dismount." They dismounted. "Surrender your arms." And to Lannes's amazement, they did just that, and were made prisoner. Naples, hoping to intimidate Napoleon from advancing on the holy city of Rome, but not daring to openly draw the sword against him, sent one of their ministers to his camp as a spy. He showed Napoleon a letter from the Queen of Naples, proposing to send an army of 30,000 men to protect the Pope. Napoleon replied, "I thank you for this proof of your confidence, and will repay you in the same way." Opening the portfolio of papers about Naples, Napoleon showed the prince a copy of a dispatch, in which the movement contemplated by Naples was not only anticipated, but in case it was attempted, a plan had been made to march an army of 25,000 men to take possession of Naples and force the royal family to flee to Sicily. A courier was quickly sent back that night to tell the Queen how her threat had been received. Nothing more was heard of Neapolitan interference. Napoleon was now within 3 days' march of Rome. The Vatican was thrown into panic. Ambassadors were hastily sent to Napoleon's headquarters at Tolentino to implore his mercy. The carriage horses were already harnessed, and the Pope was just fleeing down the stairs when a messenger arrived from Napoleon, assuring the Pope that he had nothing to fear. Having now occupied the Papal States, Napoleon could impose any terms he wanted. The Directory, infuriated by the Pope's treachery, urged Napoleon to enter into no negotiations with him, but to immediately deprive him of all temporal power. But when he came to Tolentino to meet the Pope's envoy, Napoleon found himself facing a cruel choice. On the one hand, the directors wished to destroy the papal government, but on the other were the facts. Pope Pius VI was 69 years old, a misguided but harmless old man with the usual papal foibles. He doted on a worthless nephew and his pretty wife, and he enjoyed building obelisks. But for a millennium, the Pope had been an essential part of the balance of power in Italy. He held together a pack of small states, which, without him, would fly at each other's throats. And, if Pius were deposed, then Naples, under the neurotic Queen Carolina, would seize central Italy. Marie Antoinette's sister, she was an even bitterer enemy of France than Rome. Disregarding the wishes of his government, Napoleon treated the Pope with polite deference and respect, and decided against deposing him. He would leave him his dignity, weaken but not destroy him, and attempt to win his friendship. Napoleon wrote to the Pope, "My ambition is to be called the Saviour, not the destroyer of the Holy See," unlike the usual language of a revolutionary Frenchman. "I must thank your Holiness for the courteous expressions contained in the letter which you have been kind enough to write to me. I am glad to have been able to contribute to his personal repose. All Europe is aware of the pacific and conciliatory disposition of your Holiness. The French Republic will be, I hope, one of the truest friends of Rome." Still, during negotiations, Napoleon allegedly went so far as to theatrically tear up several pages of the treaty and knocked over an inkwell, threatening that he would not be able to hold back his troops if the papal delegation failed to sign it. The Treaty of Tolentino was soon concluded on the 19th of February. Its simple terms were peace with France, the Pope's closure of his ports to all hostile navies, the acknowledgement of Napoleon's new Cisalpine Republic in Italy, and to give up 3 papal states, as well as return France's city of Avignon, one of the Pope's traditional residences, back to the Republic, plus 30 million francs and 100 works of art. Perhaps to explain his leniency to the Directory, Napoleon reported, "My opinion is that Rome, once stripped of Bologna, Ferrara and Romagna, and 30 millions, can no longer exist," adding for good measure, "The old machine will fall to pieces by itself." Napoleon had at first insisted on abolishing the Inquisition, the centuries-old tool of Catholic religious persecution. But the Pope pleaded with him not to suppress it, assuring him that it was no longer what it had been, and was now more of a police tribunal than of religious opinion, so Napoleon held back from pressing for this. However, Napoleon was not afraid to challenge church opinion on occasion. For example, when his divisional general, Vaubois, took his staff to a synagogue in Livorno, despite the outrage of many devout Catholics. The peace treaty also helped the hundreds of French priests who had been forced to emigrate to the Papal States since the Revolution. These French priests were a burden on the convents in Italy, and their priests were quite ready to drive them away. These poverty-stricken men now believed their death at the hands of the French was inevitable. One of them approached Napoleon, announcing he was an émigré priest and begging him to have him killed quickly. But the man was bewildered when Napoleon assured him that he and all his fellow priests would be protected from harm. Napoleon then issued a proclamation to his army, urging them to treat these unfortunate men as countrymen and brothers. Indeed, many of the soldiers recognized their former pastors. The Directory condemned Napoleon for this, urging him to drive them out of the country, but as he wrote back to them, "How is it possible not to pity these unhappy men? They weep on seeing us." Since they were begging in the streets, Napoleon saw to it that they were cared for, lodged and fed in the Italian monasteries. And in this decree, Napoleon added dryly that the French priests should repay this hospitality with prayers and masses at the regular market price. Napoleon's terms were less harsh than the strength of his army justified. Even a royalist enemy, Louis XVIII's correspondent in Rome, said of the treaty, "Your Majesty will doubtless be surprised by Bonaparte's moderation." Despite Napoleon's moderation, libels were circulated by his enemies and enemies of the French Republic throughout Europe. To anger the Catholics, he was reported to have seized the Pope by his grey hairs and dragged him around the room when he hadn't even met him. One day, Napoleon was reading some of these works, describing him as a licentious monster, bloodthirsty and criminal. At times they caused him to shrug his shoulders, at others to laugh. When someone expressed surprise that he was not angered by them, Napoleon replied, "It is the truth only which gives offence. Everybody knows that I was not by nature inclined to debauchery, and moreover, the number of my concerns allowed me no time for such vices. Still, persons will be found who will believe these things. But how can that be helped? If it should enter anyone's head to put in print that I had grown hair and walked on 4 paws, there are people who would believe it, and who would say that God had punished me as he did Nebuchadnezzar. And what could I do? There is no remedy in such cases." This attitude of his was just as well, because such lampoons and attacks by the press were only the beginning. All this was achieved in 9 days, security in the north, without disrupting the Italian political jigsaw. Next, Napoleon raced 200 miles north back to Mantua to prepare for his march on Vienna, and to finally compel the Emperor of Austria to make peace with France.